Hello and welcome to the Eye of the Serpent channel. My name is Edgar Martin Del Campo, and the Eye of the Serpent channel talks about native culture, religion, spirituality, and language from North to South America. And this is my first Q&A session. I offered this in August 2024, and I wanted to first thank everybody for contributing your thoughtful questions that I'm going to try to answer according to three principal themes. The first is about how I have come to this knowledge, what made me decide to learn about the languages and cultures of the Native American areas, especially the Mesoamerican region, because I was born in Mexico, and this is a part that I identify the most with. The second major theme is primary sources. What kinds of materials do I use, and what contents can I apply from these primary sources, such as the codices? And the third theme that I got through your questions was, how could this be applied to personal practice, experience, and growth? So what I'd like to do is try to take these on in each at a time. So I'd like to first start with some questions about how I have come to this channel, how the background that I bring, and what decisions I make to come to understanding and learning about Mesoamerican religion, language, and other aspects of the culture. So speaking from my own perspective, one of the first questions that I got was, how did I come to learn Nahuatl, and what made me decide to pursue this? And I would say that there were three major phases for my acquisition of the language. The first was when I was a teenager. I was about 16 years old, and I wanted to write a science fiction novel when I was living in a part of the Bible Belt, Missouri, where there was very little awareness of other creation stories aside from the book of Genesis. And I wanted to show that there was something else. And so I figured that I could learn about specifically the Mexica mythology and turn this into a science fiction story. And I kind of look back on it, it would have looked something like Guardians of the Galaxy with Aztecs. And it taught me to learn Nahuatl at a very preliminary level. I was learning a lot of the vocabulary. I was learning much of the lexicon so that I could start to see the patterns in how these nouns and verbs were being constructed. So that was my first phase, was back when I was 16, and all the way up through college. I kept trying to learn kind of the building blocks of the grammar so that I could make a believable language for my writing. Then the second phase was when I started graduate studies toward a PhD in anthropology, and I started taking formal coursework with a regimented curriculum that would comprehensively look at aspects of Nahuatl grammar through both contemporary spoken dialects, such as those in Guerrero and in Veracruz, as well as some important training in the classical dialect that was spoken by the Mexica and some of the other literary sources from the early colonial period. So that was my second phase, was when I was learning it from an academic perspective, and this was toward an academic career. So I was looking to become a professor, and for a few years I was. I taught professionally for 7 years in college, and I used the Nahuatl lessons as a recurrent part of my curriculum, teaching students about grammar, language, religion, and so on by using colonial Nahuatl materials. And the third phase was for this channel, where I actually started to look with very important discipline and dedication to specifically the classical dialect that was spoken by the Mexica and other early colonial literary resources. So this one is about specifically the classical dialect, because there is a tremendous amount of interest in the Mexica and the language and how they express their beliefs and their practices through the language. So now I'm in phase 3 of my acquisition of the Nahuatl, specifically with the classical dialect. So that is a very large part of what I am researching, specifically toward creating a new YouTube channel, or a new a video channel for YouTube, TikTok, and any other related media outlets. There are about 1.5 million speakers of Nahuatl dialects today, and they are from the West End in Nayarit and Jalisco, as well as the East End, that is like say in the coast of Veracruz, all the way down into parts of Tabasco. And so there are about 1.5 million speakers who are using a variant of or a dialect of Nahuatl in various parts of central Mexico. If we include Pipil, which is an offshoot that was spread out in Central America, then we can probably say another 20,000 speakers in El Salvador, Honduras, and possibly even Panama. So between those two communities, we can say there's somewhere around 1.5 million speakers altogether. And that also doesn't include the immigrants in the United States and Canada and elsewhere in the world who are continuing to keep their language, to preserve the language, especially when they identify as part of their own ethnic heritage. So that it is still a very active and thriving language. And I'm glad to see that there is such an interest in the language, because for many decades, there's been a long kind of shame and embarrassment for being indigenous, and that often includes being able to speak the language. So many of the more recent generations have tried to forget those these native languages, but I'm seeing more and more of a revitalization and an interest in reclaiming these languages as part of reclaiming the indigenous aspects of their identity. I myself have never identified as Aztec or Mexico or any sort of Nahua heritage. Since fifth grade, since I was like 10 years old, I was taught very early that my roots were Huichol from West Mexico, especially the area of Nayarit. But more recently, I'd say within the past 10 years or so, it's been more confirmed that we are actually of the Cora descent, or Nayarite, who are genetically and linguistically the closest relatives of Huichol, so I could understand the confusion. But Huichol and Cora are actually two separate languages. And this is another reason why I was so interested in learning about Native American cultures, because I wanted to learn more about the Native part of my own ancestry from my mother's father's background. My grandfather was from the southeast part of Nayarit, which borders the northwest part of Jalisco, and this part of Jalisco and Nayarit that was home to the Huichol and the Cora. And so I actually went to Nayarit to learn a little bit more about this part of my own roots, my own ancestry. And I realized that many of you coming to the channel are interested in learning more about this. So I try to be as diverse as possible. That's why I never really wanted this channel to be about any particular ethnic group or nationality, but really diversifies, because I've always wanted this channel to be inclusive of the larger and looking at the big picture of the Native American peoples and cultures and languages from the north to the south ends of the hemisphere. Hello, I'd like to follow up on the Q&A 2024 series that I invited you to volunteer your questions for. And I noticed that several of your questions were specifically about the primary sources that I use to research for my videos. So what I'd like to do in this installment is go through a handful of my most important resources, the primary texts that I use and I consult in order to research for many of the videos that I produce, especially around the Nahuatl language and some of the materials that are and the themes that come from these Nahuatl primary sources. So in many cases, I try to consult the original Nahuatl, and this is an example. This is the Codex Timalpopoca, which was composed shortly after the conquest in the 16th century. And this version by John Bierhorst has a transcript of the original Nahuatl. So I can look at some of these materials and translate for myself to give a transparent translation and then explain what the text means. And this is an important resource, not only because it has much of the original Nahuatl, but also it has very important content, such as the historical narrative, beginning with the Toltec and Chichimec ancestors of the Mexica and the other Aztec tribes. So it talks about the history of the Aztec nations, including the arrival at Tenochtitlan and the settlement and eventual expansion of these Aztec nations. It also has important myths around the creation of humanity, as well as the creation of the suns, the five-sun myth, the Leyenda de los Soles, which here is included in the original Nahuatl. So it has a very important historical and mythical narratives that I use recurrently in many of my works, especially about mythology and history from the Mexica's own perspective. So this is one of the most important Nahuatl primary texts that I use in my research for these videos. Another important Nahuatl Nahuatl resource, and I've talked about this in previous videos, such as, for example, talking about classical Nahuatl. This is the Mexica, or the classical Nahuatl grammar that was composed by Horacio Carochi in the 1645. And this edition by James Lockhart has incredible detail with many footnotes that go into further nuances about the Nahuatl grammar that look at contemporary dialects, other literary sources, and very critical analysis of the original text. And you can see that this too is synoptic. It has the original Spanish on one side and then the corresponding English translation. So you can see kind of like how Carochi composes like his ideas in his own words, and then Lockhart's translation on this side. And this is important because it is a comprehensive study of the details of the classical Nahuatl dialect, with with a lot of exploration of the composition of verbs and nouns, and how adjectives and adverbs are also composed or formed in the classical dialect. And this is also important because it preserves many of the vowel lengths and other markers that are often missing in colonial texts that try to transcribe the Nahuatl language. So, for example, which is the glottal stop, the saltillo, which is especially found, I would even say uniquely found in the classical dialect, but is often underrepresented in transcriptions. So sometimes it's there, but in other cases, it's difficult to figure out where it is. But this text goes through meticulous examples of how to mark for the saltillo and vowel length and other important details that are necessary for correctly reading the classical dialect of Nahuatl. And so this is another one of my most important sources, especially when I go into examples of classical Nahuatl and I attempt to transcribe them and translate them and even pronounce them for myself for the videos that I produce around the Nahuatl language. As far as rituals and religion that from the colonial Nahuatl period, this is one of my most important sources. And I've also talked about this source in some of my other videos. I have an entire video just about the content of the Treatise of the Heathen Superstitions, which was also composed in the colonial period in 1629 by Hernando Ruiz de Alarcón, who was looking at the folk Nahua rituals and spells and magic that were believed in or practiced in the rural communities in southern Morelos and northern Guerrero states, the so-called Tierra Caliente, in the beginning of the 17th century. And he was doing that, and Ruiz Alarcón was doing this because he was trying to point out that these, although the Nahua were professing to follow the Christian church, they were still practicing many of their original heathen practices and idolatries. This was much of their traditional indigenous religious beliefs and rituals, and still maintaining a lot of the ritual language. So this is this provides again a synopsis of the, or an like a comparison of the original Nahuatl and translation by Ruiz Alarcón himself, followed by a more analytical and critical Nahuatl and English translation by the scholars. These are J. Richard Andrews and Ross Hassig, who have kind of analyzed and studied and compared the ritual content of these spells to what we know from other aspects of Nahua religion from the colonial period. And so this is a very important source of Nahua ritual language, as well as much of the symbolism and the objects that are used and mythically and magically transformed into instruments of power throughout the many examples here that include rites of divination, rites of empowerment, rites of protection, protection spells, and so on. So this is a very valuable resource for my the videos, because it not only has a rich trove of content about in the Nahuatl language. So I can use this as a literary, as a grammatical resource, but also a resource for talking about rituals, especially in among the commoners, among the folk communities. So we have a very important source, which I always have to kind of add with the caveat, the caution that we have to be careful with the ways in which this material was collected, because many of them were often provided or produced through very unethical methods that were involved coercion, extortion, deception, and so on. So we have to be careful with it. But I also think that it's important that we can also use these texts to reclaim the value of the ritual language and practices that are encoded in this ritual, in these ritual texts. So that is another one of the most important sources that I use. And speaking of colonial Nahuatl, here too, this was an encyclopedia that was composed in the 16th century by the famous Friar Bernardino de Sahagún, the famous Florentine Codex. And I use this version, the University of Utah edition, because here again, we have a transcription of the original Nahuatl, and then the corresponding English translation. So I can use, so if I want to provide my own translations, I can use the English here as a guide for for translating, but I would like to be able to consult the original Nahuatl as necessary. And this is the only one that I actually have in my own collection. I actually go often to the University of Texas, which has the full 12-volume set. So I will often go there on a weekend if I need to consult any of the other works that Friar Bernardino Sahagún compiled with assistance from many of the educated elite nobles from the Nahua of Tlatelolco, which is now in the northern part of Mexico City, back in the 16th century, to create this encyclopedia of the natural history and the social history of the Nahua, especially the Mexica of Tlatelolco and Tenochtitlan. And through this 12-book encyclopedia, look at the animals, plants, the gods, the myths, the rituals, the clothing, the professions, many other aspects of the natural, social, and spiritual worlds of the Mexica as the nobles remembered from before and after the period of the conquest. So this is, again, the only one that I have in my own collection, but I will often go to the University of Texas San Antonio campus and go to their library, because there they have the entire 12-book set. So I will go there if I need to continue to find more resources or more references that involve this very important, this invaluable source of information about the history of the Mexica from the perspective of the educated Mexica elite themselves. The last one that I want to talk about is the Codex Borgia. And this is not like a Nahuatl English translation, because the text in here is entirely pictographic. These are glyphs and images that together, if you are properly trained, you know how to understand how the rituals, the myths, and other aspects of the cycles of the sacred calendar are converging and coming together in order to say something about the presence of the sacred, the presence of the spiritual powers that guide and govern the flowings of the 260-day calendar. And there are many richly illustrated examples from this reconstruction by Giselle Diaz and Alan Rogers. So based on the dilapidated and often faded content from the original codex, the author and artist were able to reconstruct the many of the details with the and attempts to even rebuild not just the outlines, the shapes, the figures, but even the original color schemes. So we have here mythical narratives, events of priests and gods. We have very important cycles involving, for example, the 20 days of the Aztec calendar, or the Central Mexican calendar, because it was not just Aztec. There were many other Central Mexican civilizations, such as in Cholula, and also similar calendar schemes in Oaxaca that were using very similar glyphs to track the movement of the 20 days and combining them with the 13 numerics to create the product of the 260-day cycle in this ritual sacred calendar. This is also has some wonderful illustrations that very telling of the role of myth, the presence of the gods and the spirits. And this illustration is of Tezcatlipoca, the god of power, the god of destiny, and the god of authority. And here you can see the 20-day signs kind of situated around different parts of his body and his accoutrements. And I would like to do a video series just on this one picture so you can see an example of how intricate and elaborate these different illustrations are. And this particular codex is so valuable because it has such a diversity of different themes around the calendar, such as rituals, myths, the different units of time, such as the count of the 9 nights, the count of the full 20 days and their respective glyphs and the gods situated in each of them, the 13-day periods. And so there are multiple levels of time, each with its own stationed divinities or gods and spirits that are associated with particular points along this. And this is an opportunity to go to one of the specific questions that I was asked in this Q&A. And this is about the cardinal direction. So I wanted to point to plate 72 of the codex, and I will put up a still that by which I can kind of go into more detail without having to hold this one up. But you can see that each of these quarters represents a cluster of the 5 days, and each of the days is each of these 5 day sets is associated with a different cardinal direction. So here, for example, in the bottom right, we have wind, death, dog, flint, and jaguar, and these are all associated with the north. Here are the figures associated with the east. They are the caiman, the serpent, the reed, movement, and the water. So here we have, so each of these has its own assemblage of day signs that are associated with different cardinal directions. So I will put up I'll put up a still from the codex that further outlines the different day signs and which cardinal directions they are especially associated with. And we can corroborate this. In fact, the Florentine Codex actually talks about some of the examples of the different spiritual forces that are associated with these same calendar directions. So we have other textual references that can be used to clarify what is going on in the contents of the Codex Borgia. I also wanted to say one last thing because I have had a question. One of the questions that I got in this Q&A session was about the Tezcatlipoca, and specifically some of the different nicknames that were associated with him. I, in fact, have an entire video about the nicknames and the monikers, other famous titles that were related to this very important god of Central Mexico. But this question specifically asked about Ipal Nemowani, which means by his grace, by whose grace there is life. That life exists. There is the condition of living. That is what Nemowani means. And I'm going to put up I'll post here a link to a Nahuatl dictionary that actually lists a number of different references, different sources that where we find instances, references to this particular name. So, for example, I believe Timalpain is one of the sources that mentions this specific name of Tezcatlipoca. But one that the dictionary does not list that I thought was very interesting is in the book A War of Witches. This is a very important book because it details shamanic practices in the 1970s, as documented by the author Timothy Knab, who actually had many of his own experiences by learning from a couple of elderly shamans from the Puebla region, the Sierra region of northern Puebla, back in the 1960s and 1970s. And through his own investigation and research, he was able to uncover a blood feud that had taken place back in the 1920s and 30s in that area that was based on conflicts over how to use land as a new landlord, as a new hacienda baron was coming in and forcing the natives to replace their traditional corn subsistence with coffee plantations. And this led to a blood feud, like a kind of a factional war within the communities that nearly broke it apart. And he began to piece this together through not only conversations with some of the some of the elderly figures, but also his own shamanic experiences by going into the spirit worlds and uncovering some of these dirty little secrets for himself. So he was able to reconstruct this kind of like a history that nobody was willing to talk about because it was such a sensitive and painful subject to recollect. But in this work, there is a reference to Ipal Namawani, which this is one of the only times I have seen a contemporary dialect of Nahuatl referenced this name. So it was interesting to see that it was continued into the present day, because other cases are not recognized. I actually, when I was doing my field work in Veracruz back in 2004 and 2005, I actually went to another town in the Huasteca area. This is in North Veracruz, where there are still many contemporary Nahuatl speakers who speak Eastern Sierra Nahuatl. And I noticed that at one of the schools in one of the nearby towns, the name of the school was Tloque Nahuaque. Well, and again, we need that saltillo to pronounce it correctly from the classical. So it would be Tloque Nahuaque. So you have that saltillo, which in the suffix indicates that he is the possessor of. So this is the one who owns all that is close and all that is near. That is what Tloque Nahuaque means. And I actually tried to volunteer this to my host when I was living in the Nahua villages in that part of northern Veracruz, and he didn't recognize it. There have been 500 years of a disconnect with the original Mexica and other Nahua nations, that many of the myths and rituals from before the conquest had been lost because of the evangelization and because of all the cultural changes that they had undergone over 5 centuries. So my host didn't recognize that. It didn't sound like Nahuatl to him. It sounded like another one of the indigenous languages, namely Huasteco, which is what they call Tenec, which is actually a Mayan language, which that broke off from the other Mayan languages about 4,000 years ago. But in any case, the host did not recognize Tloque Nahuaque as Nahuatl. So although it originally referred to one of the most important gods of the Mexica and other Nahua nations, the other Aztec nations from before the conquest, it no longer sounded like Nahuatl to the contemporary speakers. So that is something that is a precaution that you have to take, that sometimes you do find many interesting survivals of of indigenous ritual, language, and practice. But in other cases, the concept may still be there, even though the Nahuatl names for them may have been altered or changed. So this is something that I always have to kind of maneuver when I'm looking at the modern practices of these very ancient indigenous traditions. And this is my segue into the third and final installment for the 2024 Q&A, where I will talk more about how I bring many of these insights into my own practice and those that I think are worth sharing with you here in the channel. So I'm going to cut this off now because I'm losing my voice, and I look forward to concluding with more talk about how these lessons that I have gained from the fieldwork and from my research can be applicable are how I apply them in my own daily practice, as well as those that I think are most valuable sharing here on the channel. So I look forward to talking further in the final installment of this Q&A series. Hello, and welcome to the third and final installment of the Eye of the Serpent Q&A session for 2024. My name is Edgar Martin Ocampo, and as many of you know, the Eye of the Serpent channel is dedicated to Native American culture, language, spirituality, and religion. And what I'm going to do is look at some of the major ideas from the third part of your questions that I invited you to give me for this 2024 installment. So they had to do a lot with the ways in which these lessons from the channel can be put into practice. Specifically, how have I applied many of the lessons that I've gained from my travels and explorations into my own work? So this is a very complicated and very extensive subject that I would actually like to expand into new series for the channel, especially going into 2025. But I can at least make a few kind of like summarized points about like some specific examples of how the lessons that I've gained from traveling, especially to collect content for these videos, have inspired me and kind of shaped the direction that I take in terms of spiritual practice that I think could be of value and utility to any of you. So, for example, I can talk about some specific recent travels that I made since 2023. In 2023, one of my main travels was to New Mexico for the Day of the Dead week. And one place that particularly impressed me, I would say that especially good example of how I use the kinds of lessons that I've gained from going out to the field and learning from these traditions and thinking about ways to apply these is when I went to Chaco Canyon. This was actually my first full day for that week in New Mexico, and specifically the Great House of the Pueblo Bonito. And one part that particularly impressed me was not just the architecture, but also in front of the building, kind of overlooking the canyon itself. There were these two large mounds of unclaimed, unused, broken shards and debris from centuries of occupation and use. These were pots and plates and tools and other instruments that had been left by the ancient or the ancestral Pueblo peoples who inhabited the Chaco Canyon, especially like say, I think from the 9th to the 11th centuries AD. And something that I thought about was the ways that this related to many Native American concepts of the life cycle of technology, the life cycle of not just the humans and the animals of the world, but also the instruments that humans use in society. And this explains why many native cultures, especially North America, have some sort of initialization, some sort of initiatory rites for important instruments and tools that they will be using for either ceremonial or day-to-day, like say, quotidian life. And if these instruments have a beginning and a lifespan, they will therefore have an end. And in fact, in many of these same traditions, there are termination rituals. That's the term that many anthropologists use to kind of end, like ceremonially conclude and complete the life cycle of an instrument or some other technological device. And this includes household objects such as the ceramic pieces, the pots, the pans, the cups, especially once they're broken. In some cases, they will be mended and repaired and still good for reuse. But there comes a literal breaking point where that item no longer has any utility, or it's outlived its lifespan, so it is best to return it to the earth. And so these two huge mounds in front of the Pueblo Bonito Great House were just filled with these remnants, this debris from these decades or even generations of occupation and usage. And so I thought about that. How does this relate to my own use of the tools, the technologies that I have? And I thought especially about, as many of you know, I went to Salem earlier in 2024. And I actually made a short of my original apartment, which was consumed in a large house fire. And a lot of my old photos and videos and collections were completely destroyed. I would like to actually return to parts of Mexico to retake a lot of those photos and videos, especially Yucatan and Veracruz. But going to New Mexico and thinking about those deposit mounds, thinking about how once these objects ended their life, it's time to just leave them be, let them go, return them to the elements so that they can kind of return those constituents, those components, back into the life cycle of the earth itself, and then hopefully might be able to, like say, be regenerated into new resources in the earth. So it is about returning what is no longer useful and being able to let go of that attachment. And this is something that that's helped me reconcile that tremendous feeling of loss, especially in those first years when I thought about how many photos and videos and how much content that I could have used for this channel I will have to redo, but I just have to accept that they lived their lifespan. They served their purpose for the time that they had. And now I can accept that once their purpose had been fulfilled, I can let them return to the elements. In the case of Pueblo, of the ancestral pueblos in Chaco Canyon, it was specifically being returned to the earth. In my case, it was about returning into the fire and into the ether. But in all these eventualities, it's about being able to let go of things that have already lived their life out. And I can now move on and I can build new things after I have kind of accepted that these things must now be returned to the source. So that was one of the most important lessons that I have kind of been meditating and contemplating how to apply into my own daily life from that specific trip to New Mexico. Another recent one, it was from my 2024 visit to Colombia. And in this case, one of the lessons or the insights that especially impressed me was being on the Amazon River itself and being surrounded by the rainforest on both sides of this massive body of water. And it really felt like an arrival at the source of life, this kind of like being in this mythical space, this origin of the life on Earth, and a place that is still renowned as the lungs of the Earth, as a foundation to the overall life cycle and processes of the entire planet. But for me, the most important and impactful insight that I gained from actually being on the river was thinking about how each of the trees that I saw on the way was, according to the indigenous perspective, a sentient, conscious, autonomous, animistic being. It was a living person that had its own soul, it has its own will. And the rainforest itself is a network, a web of these different conscious beings, each with its own will and intentions, its own energies that are all converging and interacting with each other in this massive network of different entities and agendas and movements within this ecosystem. And so each plant, each bird, every bird that I saw in the sky, every like monkey I saw in the trees was its own person. And since I've returned to Texas, I've often go to some of the parks around Central Texas, and I like to walk around and I do similar kinds of contemplations, just kind of like these walking meditations, thinking about that same idea about how even on another continent, those principles may still apply, that the oak, the pines, and other plants and trees and deer and other wildlife are here too, sentient, conscious, animistic creatures with their own willpower and their own energies. So this is something that I got from a very powerful impression being in the rainforest itself. And I have since come to apply to other parts of the world, and it's something that I can do in just a weekend walk in the park. Just like say Saturday afternoon, I can go to one of the parks and have those similar meditations as I walk around and appreciate the life that surrounds me, even if it is a different kind of ecosystem than what I saw when I was in Colombia. So those are just a couple of the examples of the ways that my recent travels have inspired like new applications, new, like say, daily practices that I have gathered from these very recent trips. I would definitely have a lot to say about the trip to Peru from 2019 as well, but I think for the interest of the length of this video, I will definitely like to reserve some of those other travel accounts to a larger series, because I have definitely a lot to say about the different places in Mexico, the different places in Peru, Guatemala, even the United States. I have different travels have given me different insights. And so I can say that it's kind of like major themes in each of the travels that I am trying to now integrate and incorporate into a larger, coherent life way. That and some of the larger ideas that come from synthesizing these different experiences and insights into a larger philosophical kind of like a mythos and worldview that I would like to kind of develop into a series for the Eye of the Serpent channel. So those are a couple of the examples from 2023 and 2024 that illustrate how I kind of look for inspiration and try to apply those in my daily life. And the final question that I received for the 2024 Q&A session for the Eye of the Serpent had to do with how to incorporate traditions from your own heritage and your own background, but in a way that avoids the problem of exclusivity. That is, how to incorporate traditions that are not closed or would not look of appropriation. And this is something that I've been grappling with a lot, especially thinking about my own Kora ancestry and the kinds of things that I would like to incorporate more into my daily ritual activity, but at the same time, it doesn't overstep places where I have not received any kind of initiation. So something that reflects my own background, but at the same time respects when a tradition is restricted to certain practitioners, such as shamans and other ceremonial leaders. And this is something that I have to be very conscientious about. And even if I do receive initiation into any of these traditions, they would often be restricted and therefore inappropriate to divulge to public media such as the channel. So this is something that I have also been looking to reconcile in my own practice. But I guess I've thought about, like, say, my most direct answer to this question is look at what everybody is doing, the kinds of practices that every household knows how to do. If you've had the chance to go to the area where that your ancestry is from and you want to reconnect with that, maybe look at some of the, like, say, the houses around the community and find out what they all have in common. Like, for example, when I visit the houses in Veracruz, where I've done a lot of my field work, many of the houses have copal incense. They have a small domestic altar. There may be annual ceremonies where one household will invite everybody to come in, and there will be tamales, there will be aguardiente, alcoholic drink, or there could be music playing in the backgrounds. They may even hire musicians. So these are communal events. They are not restricted to any particular, like, say, specialist. You don't have like it's not restricted to the healer or the shaman or other religious leaders in the community, because everybody knows how to do these things. Everybody does them. So they are general, they are communal, and therefore there's less risk of stepping into restricted activities. So look at what everybody is doing, like, say, for the Days of the Dead or Carnival Week or like, say, a harvest ceremony, and look and think about what commonalities do they all have. You may see that there is a very traditional use of a particular incense or the presentation of drinks for a certain ceremony. So these are things that are, in a sense, publicly available, public and communal knowledge. So there is less risk of appropriation or divulging restricted esoteric information once in the cases where it is available to everyone. And I would also suggest looking at, say, the larger area. So in my case, I am a Cora, but I also have relations with the Huichol and the Mexicaneros of the Nayarit area. So I could look at not just what is in my own specific national, or, like, say, my origin, but also look at what they have in common with the Huichol or the Huixarrica or the Mexicaneros, and and the Tepehuanes of this part of Nayarit. And that way I can find some things that are of meaning and are particular to that area that allow me to connect with that part of my ancestry, but at the same time is not something that is exclusive to any particular group within that region. So that also minimizes the risk of appropriation from any specific area. So those are the kinds of guidelines that I've been using to think about and to reflect on what kinds of practices would be appropriate for me to incorporate into my life before any kind of initiation or any kind of, like, say, other conversations with specialists. And there's also the consideration of which of these practices would also be appropriate to share through public channels such as this one. So those are the kinds of reflections and a lot of the kind of personal conversations, the internal dialogue that I've been having about reconciling this idea of finding ways to connect with your own ancestry, your own heritage, but at the same time being respectful for those traditions that could be appropriate or restricted. So you just have to kind of be respectful of whatever guidelines the practitioners, the communities themselves may give you about what could be appropriate to share with a larger audience versus those that are meant for just you yourself to make as part of your own private personal practice. So I know that there is a lot of controversy right now, especially in North America, about gatekeeping and about the appropriation of Native customs. And I respect those. I definitely have a lot to say about this ongoing conversation. So these are subjects that I would like to develop further ahead, especially in the coming years. So I may come back to these in the next Q&A session for 2025. So I will let you know probably in the summer of 2025 when I repost the new an invitation for you to bring in your questions for the next Q&A for next year. And so I want to thank everybody who has gave me their questions. I thought they were very valuable, and they've given me the opportunity to share some of my own impressions and experiences with the questions that you gave me. So I look forward to sharing more of these in 2025 and in the years to come. So thank you all for watching, and please remember to like, share, and subscribe to the Eye of the Serpent channel. Your support goes toward travel, research, and production. Thank you all for watching. I will see you in 2025, and good roads.